Welcome back to the last segment before we finish. So the next topic is going to be another one that's very interesting in terms of talking about decolonization and reconciliation. So we're really pleased to have Noel Millea here, who is an educator at Elsipogtog First Nation. So I'm going to ask him to come on up. And this is for you.
So it's a beautiful honor for me to be here. I guess this morning was important that everybody take the time to acknowledge that we're on Mi'kmaq territory. This is our land. And a lot of the times that whole notion of the acknowledgement that we're on this territory gets to be just an exercise. And for us as Native people, it means something even deeper than that, because this is part of who we are. The land that because of the fact that we're so land-based, every portion of this land that we're on has very deep meaning and purpose for us. And when we speak about some of the environmental aspects of how can we help Mother Earth to sustain what we as humans are doing to her. For in our context, in our view, in our way of looking at things, we always look at probably the simplistic part, because you guys have to remember that as Native people, we're a matriarchal society. We operate from that perspective. And so a lot of the times, it's all about relationships for us. And a very good question that we can ask ourselves is, what kind of relationship do you have with the one who gave you life? Right? And so you base how you treat the sacredness of Mother Earth in the same aspects as how you will treat somebody who gave you life. And so when we look at it in that terms, it kind of like puts it into a little bit of a perspective about the Aboriginal or Native view of looking at things and how we take care of things in a very meaningful way. Some of the things that are moving forward and some of the misconceptions that are out there are all related to some of the deep systemic traumas and the pain that our people have gone through over a long period of time. And the knowledge that has been kind of like kept suppressed over a period of time as well. We also come to understand that systemic trauma was born from the whole notion of what we would call assimilation and colonization. There's nobody here that's unfamiliar with the process of truth and reconciliation, and that's how the relationship broke down. Way in the past, before the colonization began and the settlers started coming into our new, they called it a new world. It wasn't kind of like new to us, but it was new to them. We had an amazing relationship with the settlers that came. And those were a lot of the times the first ones that were here are the Acadians. And we had such an amazing relationship with them. We helped them to be able to survive in this strange new world that they came to. We guided and developed amazing relationships with them. There was lots and lots of intermarriages that were happening between the Acadian population and our people. And so as time went on and the British came and they started to have what we would call wars, and our people were getting caught in the middle of all of these wars. And that caused the annihilation of thousands and thousands of our people. And so at the end of the day, when the wars ended and the British won, they began the process of developing what we would call treaties with our people. They knew they had to do things differently. And so they developed these treaties, and all of the treaties that were developed in this part of the country were what we would call peace and friendship treaties only. In other words, there was never any surrender of any land. And I think when I think about that, I have to take time to think about my ancestors who were part of these treaties. and how thoughtful they were on how they thought about things. In my view, I think that our ancestors that signed these treaties had really a deep, deep vision of where we would be. And I think that in their mind, they thought 7 generations ahead, and that their great-grandchildren would never have to be poor when they signed these treaties, because they didn't include the giving up of any land. So there would always be resources available for our people to be able to continue to survive. And you have, when I speak about they didn't want our people to be poor, and I'm not speaking about poor in dollars and cents wise, right? Remove yourself from that way of thinking and put yourself into sustainability way of thinking. How can we continue to live within this society and to still enjoy the riches of what Mother Earth has to offer to us? From that point forward, many different things happened and many different relationships broke down, because part of the treaty process also included a whole list of things that we were supposed to do for the government, and there was a whole list of things that the government was supposed to do for us. And it was 2 nations that agreed to do this. And one of the things that they felt that they could do for us was to help us. And in their eyes, the best way that they could help us was to make us the same as everybody else. And that's called assimilation. And so that process began. They developed the reservation process, where we stayed in reservations. Before the reservation process, we were what we would call a transient people. And when I speak about transient people, I can speak about my community, which is Elsipogtog. The population of Elsipogtog now is about 4,500. And so Elsipogtog, where Elsipogtog is located now, in the past, before colonization, that was what we would call our fall and winter home. That's where our people would go for the fall and winter. And as the seasons changed, all of the community got up and left and went to a place called Kishibugwak, Point Sepat, Bay St. Dan, all along that coast. And then the seasons changed again from spring to summer, and our people once again left that area and went to a place called Shidiak. And the Mi'kmaq word for Shidiak is Esadai, and that means the furthest point. So that was the furthest point that our people would go. And so as the end of summer was coming around, they began migrating back to their fall and winter home, and they went through places like here, Dorchester, Memram, Cook, Moncton, Kokan, and Bucktouche, as they made their way back to Elsipogtog. So that was the first part of that process. And they developed reservations, and they told us that we had to stay in that reservation. And they brought in priests and nuns to help teach us about who is God. And so that process of assimilation began in that simple way. And of course, as the seasons changed again and spring came around, all of our community members up and went and left. They went back again to Kishibugwak and around that coast. The only ones that were left in the reservation were the priests and nuns. So that created a little bit of a problem for the government. It's hard to assimilate somebody who's not there. And so then this process happened, and then that's when they started incorporating laws specific to Indian reservations. And probably the first law that they created was you could not leave the boundaries of the reservation. You had to stay there, or else you would be arrested. The next law that they created, you could not speak your own language in the confines of your reservation, probably just in the safety of your own home. If you were caught speaking reservations inside the reservations or outside of the reservations, you would be arrested. They also did away with all of our cultural practices, our spiritual practices. You couldn't do ceremony, you couldn't carry eagle feathers, you couldn't smudge, we couldn't pray. and you couldn't do your drumming and your singing and your dancing. All of those were outlawed, and you would be arrested for that. These are all things related to assimilation. It was also illegal for you to have money in your pocket. So these are all things in the name of what we would call assimilation and colonization that started. And they agree with a lot of things. And because of the fact that we couldn't now move anywhere, we had to stay within that. The supply of what we needed in order for us to survive went really quickly. One of the government promises, and you guys all know the stereotypes that are out there, that natives receive everything for free. There's no tax. There's lots of alcoholism, lots of drug abuse, lots of violence. We could go on and on and on and speak about some of these things. And those are sometimes known as stereotypes. And each and every one of you have a really good vocabulary of those. And it doesn't mean that this is what you believe. But we have to acknowledge that we have them. Right? We've heard them before, we know about them. So they take up space in our minds. And sometimes when you're in a crowd and people are speaking about them, maybe in joking terms and stuff like that, probably the worst thing that happens on that part is like, nobody said anything. How many times have we heard that and we didn't say anything? We know different, but we didn't say anything. Wow. So these are all parts of the process of the colonization experience. I could probably speak quite a bit of time on these subjects. But there's quite a bit, it's very important that we get to this point of acknowledging the breakdown of the relationships. Right, and that was the incorporation of the residential school experience. This is a point in time when government agents and RCMP were going house to house and gathering up children. Well, guess what? They went to the same houses the Acadians occupied. Right? And so they were asked this question, are you Native? Because if you said yes, we're going to take your children. Why would you not deny your heritage at that time, right? Of course I'm not Native. Right? You spared your kids the experience. They might be 3/4 Native, half Native, but rather than have somebody remove your kids, you would deny your heritage. It was necessary for survival. Right? That's the breakdown of the relationship. That's where the relationship that we have with Acadian people broke down. Because I remember a time, not that long ago, when it wasn't too cool to be Indian. Now it's not too bad. You know? Because of truth and reconciliation and about the information that's going out there and the recognition of the systemic traumas that plague our communities. It doesn't mean that we have all the answers or that our communities are getting well. In our community, we're dealing with what you would call systemic traumas based from almost 5th and 6th generation of residential school survivors. Nobody in our community is now immune to that. Everybody is a survivor now. Even if one's parents never, or relatives or relations never attended residential school, doesn't mean that you're not a survivor, because you live within that environment. And what's the biggest thing there? Normalization. How do we normalize that experience? What are some of the things that have been normalized in Aboriginal communities? Trauma is probably one of the biggest things that's been normalized, and how to handle and to deal with trauma. How do you cope with shame and guilt of having abused your own children? Addictions are born from this. Mainstream society has a good idea how to numb pain, right? And we learn really well. And we've become a little bit experts at numbing pain, the pain of shame and guilt. These are all systemic things that are related to that. So it's important that we have an idea of the population that we're dealing with when we begin the process of trying to decolonize some of the things for us to be able to draw experience from. And we get back to this whole circle and we get back to relationships again. And the understanding of the loss and the breakdown of the relationship and how can we move forward from there. What are some of the skills that have been handed down through what we would call cultural norms, values, and ethics? Some of the things that we believe in really well. A lot of the cultural norms, values, and ethics of First Nations people, a lot of the times are based on our matriarchal society and the relationships that we have with each other. A good simple cultural norm, especially for educators, that it's important that you have an opportunity to learn some of these. Right, I taught at the University of PEI for 17 years, a full semester course called Indigenous Education. And it was for fourth-year Bachelor of Education students who are getting ready, or may end up, it was way back then, it was a specialized course. But these students may end up teaching in Aboriginal communities. So they went through this process of this course. And so when we got to this part about cultural norms, values, and ethics, I spoke to them how important it was that they recognize some of these things. A simple little cultural norm for us in our way of living, and it can be so easily mistaken in mainstream society because it almost means directly the opposite, and that's the whole notion of eye contact. In our way of life, we've been born, brought up, and raised to never look at somebody in the eyes. Imagine that, eh? In mainstream society, the value that you guys put on eye contact is absolutely incredible, right? It's absolutely incredible. And how easy it is for us to mistake somebody who's avoiding eye contact with us as being either dishonest, can't be trusted, or lying, or all of these things, right? But remember growing up, how many times did your parents tell you, look me in the eye? Did you do that? Of course we said no. Even if we did. And our kids can't do the same thing to us, right? And so that's a very simple cultural norm. And where does that stem from? I asked my grandmother that question one time. And my grandmother explained it in such a beautiful, simple way. Probably shocked that I asked that question. And she explained it in this way: when you look at somebody in the eyes, she said, you're trying to look at somebody else's spirit. And it's not okay, she said, to look at somebody else's spirit. So out of respect, you would avoid eye contact. And in the course that I taught there, usually after we did the cultural norms, values, and ethics part, most of my students didn't want to look me in the eye anymore. But believe you me, I've learned to walk in both worlds really well. And I always encourage you to walk in your world. This is your world, right? But if you come to First Nations communities, please take the time to learn some of these things in order for us to build relationships and move away from stereotyping. Right? If you have Aboriginal students in your classroom and they're avoiding eye contact with you, that's a deep sign of respect. Right? And I'll give you a little idea. In my family systems, when I'm speaking to my older brothers and sisters, my eyes probably will be about here. When I'm speaking to my mom and dad, my eyes are about here. When I'm speaking to my grandparents, my freaking eyes better be on the ground. See the level of respect? So that's very simple cultural norm. Right? And this is about what we would call Indianness. And we had a huge conference here a couple of years back, right in this university. And they wanted us to help the professors and the linguists and all of these things to try to decolonize curriculum. And the question that I asked them before we can decolonize curriculum, I said, you first need to know the answer to this. And so I asked them the question. And I'll ask you guys the same question, because you guys are all moving towards truth and reconciliation and inclusion and all of these terminologies that we use. And the question that I asked them is, what is Indianness? What is Indianness? If you can define that, then we can move forward. Okay? And we can decolonize anything. But first you have to know what is Indianness. Right? And so when we speak from this perspective, a lot of the times it gives us an idea for us to be able to ponder and say, yeah, really, what is Indianness? Right? It's easy when we look at it from a perspective of mainstream society. And what is Indianness in mainstream society? Of course, we're going to bring in the perceptions and the stereotypes, right? Very naturally, that's all the tools that you guys have. That's history. All of the systemic stereotypes that you guys carry, those have been handed down from generation to generation. Those are old. Very, very old. You guys know them all. We could do probably 4 or 5 flip chart pages full of them. Right? That doesn't matter now. But it's important that we recognize the source of our information. Right? Because we cannot do anything without the inclusion of our own perceptions. Right? It doesn't matter how much book learning you do. Right? At the end of the day, your perceptions play a very big part. 1 minute left. They told me they were I was at a conference one time and they had actually a clock facing me. Nobody saw just me. And it was counting down and I was speaking faster as the time. Which is really too bad. There's tons that I can speak about. But bottom line to environmental work and everything that we do, always really take time to think about the relationship. Right? In the learnings that we do in the students, in the classrooms, I'm glad that we've decolonized the classrooms and that we're not sitting in rows. But if you take time to think about some of the classrooms we have set up, they're still set up like residential schools. Right? One neat rows of classrooms. But we take the time to think about some of these things and we say, how can we include some of the natural ways, land-based learning in this process? Perfect time, you know? I had nothing to do with that. Yeah, exactly. So the land-based learning part. Land-based learning is inclusive, and it's a lot of studies have been done on it out west, and it's really progressive by utilizing the 4 quadrants of an individual. We all have 4 quadrants of self. They call it, there's the physical part, there's the mental part, there's the emotional part, and there's the spiritual part. We all have that. Every child has that. Every human being has those 4 quadrants. In a learning environment, you'll find that if you do something physical with your class at the very beginning, your ability to be able to be a sponge of information after that lasts a lot longer. Proven studies have been known to do that. So have your class do something physical at the very beginning, even if it's just a few exercises and stuff. Then you teach your lesson plan, your course, information. Then you take the time to reinforce that in an environment where I call it a sharing circle, where people have an opportunity of what do you feel about what you guys just learned. They have an opportunity to attach an emotion to it. And once they attach an emotion to it, it's permanent. Right? And so you'll learn. And the last part, which is spiritual, and don't think that spiritual in this context has anything to do with religion or God. Spiritual in this context has everything to do with having faith and belief in yourself. Right? Faith and belief in yourself is spiritual. So at the end of the exercise, if you're sitting in a circle, you can tell the students, to say one nice thing about their one sitting next to them. Or what are you grateful for? And just go around the circle. And that's the end of the class. You've utilized all 4 quadrants of themselves. Guaranteed it works. Try it out as a test drive if you want. So I'm going to have some time for questions. Limited amount of time, I know. Any questions, guys? It's $2 a question. I might as well make some money on the side here. If it's too hard, it'll be $4 a question.
You'll pay me $4, is that what you said?
No, you pay me. Because I got an answer, hopefully.
I need 10.
I take e-transfers.
One of the major ways that population reclaims its being, cultural, spiritual, etc., is through language.
Yes.
And because you've lost, what kinds of actions are the Indigenous group that you're aware of taking to reclaim
Most of
the world?
most of the language-based ones that have been lost a little bit or maybe watered down a little bit have begun the process of early grades. Kindergarten, nursery, and grade 1, I think. And then after that, it's back to mainstream education. But the foundation of the language has to begin at very early grades. And hopefully it'll be reinforced in the homes. The loss of the language in our communities has been very, very devastating only because of the fact that parents taught their kids in English. And there was a prophecy where the old people spoke about this, and they said, if you want to know how much your language has been lost, watch how the children play. And when they start playing in English, your language is in trouble. And the kids are now playing in English. Any other questions? Go ahead, brother.
Hi, very, very interesting. I'd like to get your feeling on the appropriateness of using the word Indian. You mentioned Indianism. And I guess when I grew up, I'm sort of an insult to call a First Nations person, or what terminology should we use?
Exactly. That's all misused and overused a little bit. And this goes back a little bit to this whole notion of the most important thing, guys, you guys have to stop being afraid of Indians. Jeez, everybody's so afraid of Indians for some reason. And that's part of the reason why people are so afraid of being politically incorrect and insulting or anything like that. You have to, at the very first part of that process, in relationship building, it would be good for us to acknowledge that, and to say, I'm not very familiar with this. I apologize if there's anything that I might say. Just take that fear away, right? But if you and I are in conversation and you're so afraid of saying anything politically incorrect, you know what I sense? Fear, right? And what does that fear tell me? Get away from me, right? It's dividing rather than bringing us closer. We'll stop being afraid of us.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for coming in and talking to us. This is the first time in my life that I've ever had a First Nations person tell me the history of assimilation from First Nations point of view. I've never heard all that before. I mean, I've read about it, but I've never actually heard it firsthand from somebody. And so thank you so much for telling us this. And I think if more students could hear that story that you told us, from a person that's been through that and their family, that it would make a huge difference in their understanding of Indigenous rights and history.
Exactly, and that's another good point that Noel brings is it's important that maybe we do some work in the curriculum part of inclusion and stuff like that. But if we're going to do any real work within that, bring in Aboriginal speakers and teachers to teach those classes. Okay, non-natives teaching Indian stuff isn't cutting it. Okay, because we're surfacey and it's not emotional based. Because there's not a vested interest in change. You can all feel my vested interest in change, right? Because I speak quite freely, right? In mainstream societies as a teacher, you're always holding back and having that fear again of not wanting to misrepresent or say too many bad things, and you know you're going through a whole lot of things in your mind, and somehow inside of you, you know this is not yours. But for me, I have a knowing that this is mine. I'm living the experience. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.